So let's think about a question. Imagine that you went to a bank and you applied for a financial product like a loan for a home. And you submitted all the paperwork. It was processed by the bank. And a few days later, you were rejected. And you went back to the loan officer and asked why. And they said, hey, our AI decision-making software screened and scanned your application and said, unfortunately, no. What would you do? Dave, what would you do?
It's tricky, right? I mean, it's already hard enough to communicate with banks as it is, and now they're moving it into this completely amoral space where essentially this software is going to be making a decision. And I mean, I'm not really sure you would have a recourse, would you? Like they're not going to give you access to the algorithm. They're not going to show you probably exactly why. And it just seems like it would be one step further away from kind of a balanced negotiation between you and the service provider, right?
Yeah, and so I think that's a good point, and the idea of not having recourse is really key, because I think it raises really fundamental questions about what's fair, right? Because if that discrimination, if let's say your rejection by the bank was based on some level of latent discrimination based on biased data or other forms of bias that may exist in that AI process, then there's some issues of fairness if you can't go rectify that.
Yeah. Well, why is it so critical that banks, or really even we more broadly, think of these questions now, especially like something like bias? I mean, isn't that something that should come out later on?
I think what we're finding already is that the longer we wait, the more difficult it will be to implement kind of cleaner AI that has more cleaner or filtered data. And partly because data compounds. There's troves of data being produced every day. And if we're not aware of the influence of how that's compounding and the negative inputs that are already there, then that potentially becomes a problem, particularly since a lot of that data is already based on historical data we know incorporates bias that existed because societal norms were different in the 1960s or 1970s versus what they are today.
Well, can't they just clean it up? Like, can't we just make it neutral somehow?
Well, I think in certain cases, you could perhaps be able to do that. But in a lot of situations, what that would do is, in the process of cleaning that up, perhaps other factors of the data that you may need to rely on also get influence. So that data is also not clear anymore. And so this then becomes a little bit of a catch-22.
Yeah.
Fixing one problem creates another problem.
Yeah. Okay, so where do you fall on this line? So let's say we know that humans are very imperfect, and we know that most of the bias that we have in the data is there because humans are biased, and they would discriminate for race or gender or nationality and for a whole host of other reasons. And so on the one hand, we clearly do not have a perfect track record. But on the flip side, we are now potentially entering into this area of complete amorality that's going to be built on the back of existing historical data and could introduce a whole new set of bias, or even worse, entrench existing bias into these decision-making processes. So what would you trust more? Do you trust the kind of human bias that's inherent in the existing systems? Or do you trust the potential bias in these data sets and AI that's going to be coming in the next few decades?